Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our webinar on the time off process migration. My name is Sarah Hulsey, and I head up the customer success group within Sage People's North American clients. And I'm really excited to be talking to you about this today because if any of you have ever come into contact with me, you know that I love absence. As strange as that is, it's something that I think is not only very useful, but it is also very complex, which I like because that means it's very challenging and it's also very configurable in a way that's going to help a variety of clients. So today we are particularly going to be talking about how do we actually migrate from the old absence functionality to the new time off functionality. Today's session will be recorded and I will be pausing at intervals just so that after we have finished today's session, we can actually splice this into separate segments and publish them individually. If you do have questions that you would like to ask, please use the questions pane within your controls. And while you're doing that, if there are things that are really urgent, you can't see, you can't hear, that sort of thing, please also put those in the questions pane and we'll have someone hopefully get back to you privately. I will be reserving time at the end of today's session for questions rather than as we go. And we're going to do something slightly different with this as far as I'm going to recommend how you experience this webinar. With time off migration, it's impossible for most people to be able to follow along with what I'm doing in their own customer org, and that's just because every org looks and feels a little bit different. So what I'm going to suggest you do is watch the webinar in its entirety, take notes of things that you want to make sure that you double check on or things that you think are noteworthy for you. And then once you can watch the replay, follow along, pause, do the steps on your own customer org, and then come back and replay. So we're just going to kind of do a watch, click, along sort of thing. So let's get started. First off, migration timeline. It will actually kind of shock many of you that the time off calculator was actually first introduced in our Poseidon release, which was summer of 2018. That was the first time we rolled it out. And since then, the calculator has been through multiple improvements. There have been features developed that are only used with the new time off calculator, but we have allowed customers to use both the absence and the time off processes until this time. With Winter 21, which was just our recent release that has been out, as you guys probably heard me talk about in the winter release webinar, that we finally announced we will be fully deprecating the old absence process. So that announcement just came out, and then we've got a nice handy line of you are here. We are in this section between Winter 21 and 1 year later, Winter 22, by which all customers will need to have migrated to the time off process. At this same time, there will be no longer, the support team will no longer be able to help you with cases related to the absence process. It's all going to need to be time off. And then by spring 22, we will actually have fully deprecated absence from the system, meaning you will no longer be able to turn off time off, and you will no longer be able to even access that information from absence. So that is where we are at in terms of a timeline. So for those who are unfamiliar, what is time off? So time off is the name of a process, and it replaces the old absence process and fixes many, many bugs that were in the old code. The absence code is actually some of the oldest pieces of code that exist in the Sage People system. And what it had enabled us to do, or excuse me, enabled you to do to some degree, is actually configure it in a way that you could configure yourself into a bug. And that's a very complicated way of saying it didn't work exactly right, but most customers were be able to vary the actual configuration of their absence process so that they could actually use it as they needed. But that caused a lot of problems anytime that we would have new changes made to that code. So this is a much more improved code that provides more accurate data. It is faster in many instances. It can be used anywhere that you could use the old absence process. So you can use it with Payflow, the normal reporting that you do in the HR portal, WX reports. And most importantly, it allows us to build new and better functionality to support your time needs. So an example of this is the absence balances batch, which is a new batch that we rolled out maybe a year, 2 years ago. That absence balances batch had some limitations. For example, you could only report on the balances of things that were a vacation type. We've now been able to replace that using time off with something called the accrual balances batch. Yes, I realize those things look very similar, but the point being is that it's allowed us to actually build and create new things, including several features are only available if you're using time off. So for example, work schedules, which is a feature that we have that enables you to better place how many hours does this employee typically work on a day and what are their days off. We've rolled out things, the partial day absences, which you may have seen quite recently. And if you happen to attend the Winter 21 release webinar, you actually got to see a sneak peek of a new absence modal or UI for actually requesting absences in the system. So a lot of what we're doing really depends on being time off. And so again, that's kind of reinforcing the importance of getting you guys migrated as soon as possible. Do you need to migrate? So to a good check that if you wanted to do this right now while I'm talking, you probably could, is quite simple. If you go to installed packages and you look at the HCM package configure button, if you have this tick box ticked for time off calculator and in WX services, if you have a WX process called time off rather than absence, you are done. That is all you need. That is actually the only two things that are required to actually turn on time off. So if you've done that, while I appreciate your attendance today, feel free to drop off. However, we would love for you to stay and attend. If you do not have those two things, then today's webinar is for you. So let's jump right into it. So migrating to time off, and the reason we've got a 2-hour webinar to discuss it today is that there's a process to it. While it is quite easy to just turn it on, because the old calculator had so many bugs kind of built into it and the new calculator fixed those, it means that some balances are going to be different when you turn on the new functionality. In order to mitigate that, that's why we have this webinar today where we're going to take you through migration steps to make sure that you're able to turn this on with the least amount of impact possible for your end users. So what does it look like? We will be going through some pre-analysis checks, things that you actually need to confirm are present in your system before we can begin. We'll actually set up some of the tools you're going to use to migrate. We are going to go through an actual analysis of how the balances differ between the two systems. We will investigate why are those balances different. I'll walk you through some edits that you may need to make in order to facilitate the migration, or at least to be able to decide, do I need to do anything different? Then to wrap up the actual migration, you will disable absence features and enable time off features. So let's get started. Pre-analysis checks. For today's presentation, I'm going to be following some of the information that is actually in our customer community. So when we are looking at the customer community, if you go in here and you search for time off, one of the first items that's going to come up, and it's often in your recent items if you're like me, is this article called Absence to Time Off. And there is a support guide that is contained within that post. So the information that we're going to be using today is going to follow these steps. So if you are the type of person that you really want to see the visual, you want to see the words, please make sure that you've got this bookmarked or printed out and are using it. So we're going to be following that as we're doing some of these checks that you see here in assumptions, and then there's some switching to time off pre-switch checks. So the first thing you're going to do is request a sandbox refresh. We are going to do all of these steps using sandbox because we don't want to be fiddling with our live environment, and as we go through this, potentially enabling time off that may cause a change in what your end users see. So while you absolutely can do this in production, most clients find it easiest to do this in sandbox. The next thing you're going to do is create a report type and look for rules with or without seniorities. So I'm going to be walking you through each of these things in today's presentation. So the reason that we're going to take this step here is that one of the things that is required for the time off process to work correctly is that every single rule that you have must have a seniority, even if that seniority is just blank or full of zeros. So I have a standard trial org today, and one of the things that I'm going to do, which is a little non-traditional for these webinars, is I'm going to switch back to classic. And that's because there are some shortcuts and little tricks that I'm going to show you today that only work in classic. So I do recommend that you utilize classic while you are going through these changes. So in order to create a report type for rules with or without seniorities, the first thing you're going to do is go into setup. When you go into setup in the quick find, you're going to type report types and find your report type selector. I'm going to create a new custom report type. And when I do this, my primary object for this report type is going to be absence accrual rules. So not patterns, we want to use absence accrual rules. And I'm just going to call this, I've already got a little text down there, absence accrual rules with or without seniorities. I'm just going to kind of whiz through this because we are really just doing this for testing purposes. I want to make sure to select deployed for the deployment status and click next. Once I get to the next screen, I want to identify any absence accrual rules and the related absence accrual seniorities. But very important, I need to make sure to change this to absence accrual rules may or may not have seniorities, because that's going to enable me to find the ones that don't have that. Now, the area of the system that I'm in right now does require that you have an administrator license in most customer orgs to actually do this. So if you are an HR manager who does not have some of the back end permissions, you may not be able to do this step. And I would recommend reaching out to your system administrator to do so. So I've got that, I'm going to click save. So now, in order to finish off this pre-analysis check, I'm going to open up my reports tab and I'm going to create a report using that new report type. So I've got new report. And I'm going to search for AAR because that's what I had titled this. Click create. And now we're going to filter the report to make sure that it's showing the correct data. So typically, the first thing you do is look at show, and do I have any other options? No, it's already going to show me all absence rules, so that's good. Here I've got a date field filter, but I don't need this because I want all dates that are out there. So I'm simply going to delete the dates from that filter. Next thing I want to do is, here I've got my absence accrual rule name and the seniority name, but what I'm looking for are what are the rules that don't have seniorities. So at this stage, actually, I can simply run my report. And when I do this, I can filter, or not filter, excuse me, I can sort by clicking the header of this, and I can actually see that I do have two rules that do not have a seniority. So now we're going to take our first change to make sure that we are set up for success. So I'm going to open in separate tabs by clicking Control and then click that actual rule. And I see that, this is something where I don't actually need a seniority for. It's not something that's accrued over time. So I'm simply going to create a new absent seniority and just save it, because that basic default information that comes up when I create a rule like this, excuse me, seniority, it's just saying the seniority of 0 months, and it doesn't actually give them anything. It's a blank seniority, and save. So now if I come back to my report and I rerun it, I should now see that I do not have any rules that don't have seniority. So step 1 is complete, and I can get rid of these tabs. We're not going to need them again. Looking back at our presentation, the next thing that we're going to do for our pre-analysis checks is we need to identify any absence accrual rules that have some bad information in rounding mode, rate per, and deduct order. So the reason that we're looking at this information, in fact, if we wanted to go to our customer community and look at that, that guide on absence to time off, this will actually tell you, for example, if we're looking at rate per, there needs to be a value in the set field. So it tells you why is it that we are looking at these things and what the contributing factors are. So with rounding mode, all absence rules must have a valid rounding mode value, even if you're not using rounding. So if you're not using rounding for a rule, it needs to be set as a value of none, not a blank. So I'll show you what that means right now. So if we go back to our system, we are going to create a list view that's going to enable us to see this information. And here's where I'm going to show you my first trick that is only available in Classic. So the first thing I'm going to do is find an absence accrual rule. And for this, you can use any rule whatsoever. So if I go into the China absence accrual pattern, here is a rule here for vacation. Once you are on an absence accrual rule, you are going to go into the URL of your screen, and you'll notice you've got this Salesforce ID. That's what this string of characters is right here. It's the Salesforce record ID for the page that you're on. You're going to delete everything except for the first 3 letters of that string. So now I have A2V showing, and I'm simply going to click enter. Once I do this, this creates a page where I am looking at nothing but absence accrual rules. And this will give me the opportunity to create a list view where I can actually see all this information at once. So I refer to this, sometimes you'll hear me say a hacked list view. That is what I'm referring to when I use that phrase. So now that I've got my rule, I want to create a new view and pull in these pieces of information that I need to be looking for. So we're going to call this time off migration view. You can call this whatever you would like. And I want it to pertain to all absence accrual rules. And I don't need to create any filters here because, again, I'm looking for this information across all areas. And per the information that's in the presentation, the things that I need to be looking at are the rounding mode, so we'll pull that over, rate per, and then deduct order. So once I have this, it might be useful, just so that I kind of know what sort of rule I'm looking at, to go ahead and pull in the type and reason fields. These are showing me, is this a absence rule for vacation, or excuse me, is this a vacation rule for like holiday, or is it an absence rule for sick leave, so on and so forth. I really don't need to do anything with visibility because I'm the one doing these checks. However, if you have a team working on this, you may want to make this visible to all users or certain groups of users. So at this stage, I'm simply going to save. And now I see all of my absence rules and all the various pieces of information. So let's talk briefly about each and what we need to do. You're going to take each header here and go ahead and sort by it because we're looking for blanks at this stage. And if I look at my presentation, I'm again looking at rounding mode, rate per, and deduct order. So when I look at rounding mode, I know from the information on the community that rounding mode cannot be blank or none. So at this stage, I can see that, interestingly, I'm missing a couple pieces of information on these other fields, But if I knew and I had gone ahead and investigated by opening these rules, what type of rule they were, and so that I could ascertain, do I actually need to add a rounding mode because it's something that's going to be displayed in WX, or is it something that I don't need to worry about? For today's presentation, I'm simply going to set both of these to none. So you are going to click the box for any rules that you want to edit, double click here, and then I want to change this from a value of blank, which is where you see the dash dash none dash dash, to an actual value of none. And make sure that you apply the changes to all the records that you've selected and save. So now that is done. The second item we have here is rate per. And if I look at rate per, again, a value must be set in this field. Now we could do the same exercise that we're doing right now by identifying which rules are missing this information, potentially using things like, other reports or, things like that. But I really feel like the list view is the best way to go about some of the checks that we're going to be doing, because you have the ability to not only investigate, but bulk edit at the same time. So again, for these two, I am actually going to set these both to not accrued, even though I do have a vacation rule here. So maybe that's one that should be accrued in a different manner. So if that were the case, I would want to open up that rule, find out what is it and what sort of rate per should I be actually adding on there. Again, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just simply going to set all of these to not accrued in all records. You obviously would want to be editing these for what is needed for your organization. Now, the third one that I had on my list was deduct order. Now, if you are following along and looking at the switching to time off checks, deduct order is actually not in this document. This is my own personal point of view. The reason I have deduct order on here is that it's one of those fields that if it is not set up, it does have the potential to cause some differences between the old absence process and the new time off calculation. So if you know in your organization that you always deduct balances first, they would deduct time in lieu from an absence record, then any carryover, then accrual. If you know that that is the same across the board in all of your locales in which you do business, even though it is not required, it may be advantageous to go ahead and set that up as well. So we're not going to do it today because it's not a requirement. It's just something I'd like you to be aware of, that deduct order could be something that needs to be looked at on a larger scale if you are seeing issues. Now, this issue does not present itself in 100% of configurations, which again is why I'm going to leave this out as optional. So at this stage, we have now done our step 3 here of looking at any blank values and editing that in our system. The next step is we are going to do something, actually we're not going to do this one in today's session, just because it's something that only affects a small number of organizations. Now, if you are a business that has a rule where you can have multiple years of carryover. This is very common in some of the Nordic countries and as well as some other locales. If you do have multiple years of carryover, you're going to want to make sure that on the absence seniority, you have a value for maximum annual carryover if required. So please see that migration guide for more detail if your rule does have multiple years of carryover, but we will not be covering it explicitly in this presentation. It's just simply a field on the seniority page, and you can use that same hacked list view that I just showed you to do that. The next item we're going to look at is absence records, list view, and report. So with this check, what we are looking for is we want to make sure that there are no absence records, so individual records of an employee requesting absence that have a blank value for days and hours, And we want to make sure that we don't have any data quality issues where an end date of an absence might be recorded before a start date. You may be thinking, how in the world could that happen? It most often happens when you're doing a manual upload, or if perhaps someone was doing some data cleansing and they mistakenly edited an absence that they shouldn't have. We do see this happen from time to time, so we're going to go through an exercise of making sure that's not the case in our org. So let's go back to our system, and we're going to go back to our handy reports tab. So for this type of report, you are going to use an existing standard report type. I'm going to search for absences, and I want to pull up employment history with absences and use that report type. Do not use activities with absences. You're going to want employment history because that enables you to filter correctly. So once I'm here, I'm going to go ahead again, play with my filters, make sure that I'm looking at all employment history. I don't have any dates to filter here, which is good because I want to make sure that I'm looking at everything. But one of the things that I do want to filter for is to only look at active team members, because I don't really need to be going through this exercise for someone who's no longer at my organization. So I'm going to search for has left in my fields and pull that over here into here and say has left equals false, because I only want to include records on people who are still here. From here, I need to pull in the various fields that I need to look at. I always like to include team member name because that helps me to be able to then go back into the system and more easily look at an individual if there's changes that need to be made. I also need to pull in days, hours from the absence record. The start date, now notice I've got a start date under employment and a start date under absence. I need to make sure that I'm only pulling in the start date for the absence record. And then finally, same thing, end date, I want the end date of the absence. So here I've got all the filters that I need, so I'm going to run my report. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, we are going to sort by days, hours, and see, do we have any records missing days, hours? I sure do. I've got 2 of them here. So just like some of the other things that we've done today, I'm going to open up the absence record in another tab, and I'm going to make sure that those days, hours are correctly populated. So here I see I've got a 1-day absence. Now, if you were doing this in your actual org, you may already know that my volunteering rule is done in hours as opposed to days, so that you would know this needs to be 8 hours as opposed to 1 day. So make sure that you have double checked within the actual rule itself to ensure that you are entering the correct type of value. But again, just for explanatory purposes, I know that this is volunteering for 8 hours, and I'm going to switch it to that. For this one here, I believe also for Kate, I think that she also is in a hours type of scenario. So she has a start date from 8/22 to 9/2. Now this is going to get a little dicier because I've got to calculate what do those hours need to be. So if I just double click here, we've got 8/22 to 9/2. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days. So if I use my calculator, if I'm not feeling very confident, which let's be honest, I always use my calculator just to double check, that tells me I've got 64 hours here. And save. So now back on my report, I can run it and confirm that I no longer have an issue with missing days or hours. So the next item that we were supposed to look at is, are there any records where the end date is prior to the start date? Now that's not something I can easily do from within a report. So what I'm actually going to do is export it into Excel, where I can do these things quite simply. Now, if you are a whiz with formulas, it is absolutely fine for you to do this within your system by creating a formula that calculates, is this date before this date? I, however, like to do things very fast, and so I'm just going to do it using Excel. So how would I do this in this instance? So I've got my dates here. I simply need to create a formula field that is going to look at it and say which ones do I need to take a look at. So I'm going to use my function insert button here, and I want to use an if statement. And I know this is going to pop up very small, but this is great if you're not very familiar with how to write an if statement. If you simply click the little FX button for function, it will walk you through the process. So the logical test that I'm looking for, and if I click this little arrow with a line underneath it, it'll allow me to choose cells within my spreadsheet. So I want to know if the end date is less than the start date, and now that's really the only argument I want to look at. If the end date is less than the start date, I'm just going to give myself a visual indicator that I need to fix it. I'm going to say fix. However, if the end date is not before the start date, then I know it's okay. So I'm going to use fix and okay as my values. You could use whatever you would like here and then click OK. Once I do that, and I'll make this slightly bigger, apologies, probably should have done that before. Once I have done that, if I have that formula, if I simply take that small box in the bottom right-hand corner and double click, I will now take that formula and attribute it to all my rows. A very easy way to view your data and see if you have any that you need to fix is to go to the Data tab, click Filter twice to pick up filtering on the new row we just created, and then I want to sort this to only show me ones where I have a fix as my formula result. And sure enough, I've got two. Charles and Kate both have some issues with an absence. So at this stage, what I'll need to do is actually go back into the system, find these absence records, and fix them. So we're going to go ahead and start a little split screen here. If I wanted to, I could do this from directly in my report. I could either filter or sort my absences or my team member name to find it, or I could simply just search for this information in the system. So if I choose to search, I can search by that number, and it's going to give me the absence for Charles. Now I see that we have a weird start date and end date, but it was only one day. Now, what I would do at this stage is check back to my records and see if I can figure out what this should have been. In this instance, let's pretend that the correct value should have been 3:30 because it was just a one-day absence, and save. I'll do the same thing with Kate's record here. So we've got number 352, Kate, and she's got a 2-day kind of gap here that things look a little off. So again, for just the purposes of us figuring out what is going on, you would do your own investigation, but I'm actually going to assume that this got transposed. And this is actually the 10th through the 12th, and it was a total of 12 hours. So that's just what I'm going to put there. Again, you would find out the truth before you make that change and save. So now at this stage, I have done all the fixes that I needed to do on this report, so I can go ahead and close it out because I'm not going to need it again. If I go back into the presentation, we have now finished all of our pre-analysis checks. So going to move on next to our migration tools setup. And very briefly, before I do that, I'm going to just check the questions to make sure that there's nothing major that we won't be covering later. Okay. Next in our migration workflow, we are going to have the migration tools set up. So this is just going to walk you through what changes do I need to make to my system before I start. As you've already seen, I recommend that you be in Salesforce Classic as a first step. And then you need to make sure that you have 2 items enabled within your org. The first sits on the employment record, and it is a button called Accrual Log. Absence calculator is one that you're probably much more familiar with because it's what you would normally use with the old absence process to look at someone's balance. Accrual log does the exact same thing, but for the new time off calculator. This next one down here, create accruals, I would also include that as an optional, and this is not one also that is listed in the migration steps. You are going to need this button if you do discover there are multiple discrepancies that you're going to have to fix or address. However, if you find that there is no difference between the two calculators, you actually don't need this step. And then of course, you're going to need Excel to work through this. So if you are unfamiliar with how to add buttons, I'm going to show you that very briefly. The easiest way to add a button is to be on the page where you want to see that button. So if I go to any employment record, so I went to team members and then just open someone's employment record, I know the first place that I need this button is on the absences related list. So when it appears, however, if the page that I'm on right now is actually the employment record. So from this employment record, I can click this little blue arrow over on the side. However, if I didn't have this arrow, by the way, you can speak with your customer success manager, that can be added on most objects. You could just also go to setup and then navigate directly to the employment record. From here, I am going to edit layout. Now, another way of doing that that's even easier is to simply go back to that top of the page and click the edit layout button, but layout is what we're trying to get to. From here, I have two options. I see buttons here, but this buttons here is to only look at the buttons that are shown at the top of the employment record. What I'm actually trying to do is edit the buttons that are on a related list. So if I select related list and find my absences related list, click the wrench or spanner, depending on where you are at, and down at the bottom, I will have a section for buttons. It's not readily apparent because it's always going to be collapsed by default. So just know that you need to click that little plus sign to get your buttons. And then from here, you can add in that accrual log button. Now, I'd like to make a note really quickly. There is another button available called comparison. This is a older button, which is no longer in use for the time off process. It used to have some implications for a time off migration. Now, however, it's actually used with the new high precision calculator, which is not a subject that we are going to cover today. I will provide some advice. I do not believe you need this in your organization at this time, and I would recommend removing it from view as to not create any sort of confusion. So once you have that accrual log, you can simply save it and it will now show up in your related list. And that is how you add a button. So we've got our button added. We will, as I mentioned, take a look at that create accruals, not right now, but once we do, here we've got that accrual rule layout. You would just navigate to buttons and then pull that down. And then of course, we're going to need Excel. So now it is time to start the balance analysis. Here is where the fun begins. And I know some of you are chuckling when you hear me say the fun begins, but it really is fun. So the steps that we are going to walk through together, I am going to speed up a little bit just for time, just so that we're not having to sit and wait on batch processes. But you are going to first run the absence balance batch with time off. So you're going to run it using the old process. You are then going to create a report that is going to enable you to export those values and save it somewhere. Then you're going to turn on time off. You're going to repeat the exact same steps. Once we have two reports, we are going to compare the two reports in Excel, and then we're going to add in a formula field or two to help us create a visual representation of what the differences are. Because if we're really looking at the whole process of migrating to time off, what you really need to know as a system administrator is, are my balances any different using this new calculator? If the answer is no, good, congratulations, go turn it on and you are done. So that's really what the point is of this entire exercise, is to define what is the delta in balances between these two calculation methods. So let's go ahead and get to work on this. So for a little bit of the presentation, I am going to go back into a split screen just so that you can, well, I guess that's not going to work with presentation mode. That's all right. So we've got our process of, here we are. I guess it's a little hard to see, but it's okay. So to navigate to installed packages, you are going to go to Setup. In the Quick Find, you're going to search for installed, select installed packages, and you are going to go find the Fair Sale, or sometimes it said Sage People Human Capital Management Package, and click Configure next to it. Once you are in here, you are going to scroll down to the features section and just confirm that time off is not on. We want it to be off the first time that we run this package. Once you've confirmed that it's off, you are going to look in the setup section and find an item called Hold Absence Balances. This is the absence balances batch, which is an Apex job that runs and looks for the balances of, as you can guess, absences. And you're going to click Run Now. That batch is going to take anywhere from, it could take 60 seconds, depending if you've got a small group, or it could take several minutes if you have a large number of plans and different employees to run it on. So for the purposes of today's presentation, this morning, actually, you can see here at 3 a.m., my batch already ran. So once it ran, then I'm, as we know, going to kind of do the process in reverse, but with absence. But before I can do that, I need to have a report that is going to give me those balances. So I'm going to keep this open, and I'm going to go back to my reporting tab. And, I think we're actually going to need this. I'm going to go ahead and maximize that. I'm going to do a new report. For this one, you are going to use the absence balances object. Now I'm going to zoom in because it's a very important distinction. When you are creating this report, be careful that you don't accidentally use the accrual balances report type. That is for the new functionality that's used with time off. For today's purposes, we only need the report type of absence balances. So use employment history with absence balances. I personally don't believe you need the team member object in there for what we need to do today. Just use absence balances and create. From here, we're going to do a similar type of filtering. We want all employment history. We do not want there to be any sort of date filters. And I want to only show employees who have not left. So has left equals false. Okay. From here, if I get rid of this, I can see that in this report type, I have items from the employment record and the absence balance record. I would go ahead and just minimize employment records so that you're not tempted to throw any things in there you really don't need. But what we want is the information about an employee's balance. So team member, of course, is something that we need because we're going to want to know the individual this is pertaining to. You're going to want to know for this report, what is the reason and type? So holiday, vacation, absence, etc. From there, the rest of these fields, I'm going to minimize just slightly. The rest of these fields here are all the fields that are contained on the absence balance object. If you want to do the most amount of checking possible, then you might as well pull all these fields, anything that contains a balance, into your report. For I would say 90% of clients, the only things you are realistically going to look at are accrual and year-end balance. But for the purposes of today's report, I'll go ahead and throw everything in there that we might possibly need. So I'd want to know what's their current balance. How much do they get on an annual basis? Because really I'm looking at anything that I might want to compare between the two groups. Available carryover, next accrual. I actually don't want to know about next accrual because I know that it's just going to use seniority and that's okay. I might want to look at, does take-in change? Has toil changed? And all these others in here too, year-end balances and year start. Now notice these year start balances, those are only used with the new time off functionality. And if you're using absence, you actually can't report on these values. So for the first time we run this report, those fields are actually going to be blank. So I'm going to pull them in here. I can see that I've got a bunch of data. And I think the last time I ran this, I actually used time off, which is why you do see some balances in there. But I would create this report, I would run it, and then once I have the report together, I would export it to Excel. So again, with the magic and wizardry of internet, I have already taken these steps here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up what that report looks like. So once I export the report, we get something that looks like this. Now, at this stage, what I would like you to do is some special sorting on this so that we can more easily compare it to our other data. So if you click Data and then Sort, you're going to want this whole report sorted first by team member name, and then add a level to sort by absence reason, and click OK. With this, of course, you're going to maybe want to save it so that you have it. We'll go back in here to our report. So step 2 after this, or I think we might even be on 3 by now, is to then come back into Install Packages, enable time off, and then once again click the button for Hold Absence Balances. And this is going to do the same steps that we just did, but using the new time off calculator as opposed to the old one. Once that has finished running, you're going to go back into that same report that you did. You're just going to click Rerun, and the report will then update with the information from that new batch. Then you will once again click Export Details, export it, and once you do that, you're going to get another Excel sheet with the data that is for the time off calculator. Again, I'm going to go to Data, Sort. I want to sort this the same way that I did my first report. So team member, add a level, and then sort by absence reason. Okay, now we are going to put these two things together so that we can actually compare them. I'm going to select all my data. This is in my second report. This is in time off. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to open up my first report. I'm going to scroll over. And just because I'm really nervous about commingling my data, I'm going to simply go over a couple of columns and click Control V to paste my data. So now I've got two separate data sets. Over here on the left, I have my absence data. On the right, I have my time off data. And because I have already sorted my data to match, I know that I've got my data in the correct order. Now, at this stage, if you, again, are really worried that your things are not lining up, you can use tools like VLOOKUP, if that's a function that you are more familiar with, to compare the two workbooks side by side. So I'm going to add in grid lines because I like grid lines. It helps me kind of visualize things better. But now at this stage, what I need to do is compare my two reports. So here in the middle between the two, I'm going to highlight these just so it's easier for us to see, but I'm going to create some differences columns. So in column 1, I wanted to show the current balance difference. In column 2, I want it to show year-end balance difference. You would repeat these 2 steps on any other values that you want to compare between the 2. And now it's doing a simple formula. So for current balance difference, I want to find out how different is the new calculator from the old. So I'm going to create a formula that says this cell equals, and I'm going to find my accrual field on time off, minus my accrual field from absence, and then click enter. And just like we've done before, I'm going to double click at that square at the bottom to pull that down to the rest. Then I'm going to do the same thing with year-end balance. Equals, I'm going to find year-end balance minus year-end balance on absence, and double click. Important step here is to get all of our data on one page for filtering. So if you are familiar with Excel, you can see that I've got little boxes at these headers which indicate that I can sort by those columns. But when I sort, it's not going to affect the data that is after column Q. So in order to get all of my data on one page, so to speak, I'm going to once again click the Data tab, Filter, I'm going to click it twice, and now I've got those same little boxes across all lines of data. And what this is now going to enable me to do is sort to find out where do I have differences. So you can do this a couple of ways. If you want, you can just remove anything that's 0 because you don't really care if there's a difference. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my zeros. However, if you didn't want to take that step, you could just simply sort, smallest to largest. So I prefer to keep all my data in just because I don't want to worry about something like this happening where I've accidentally filtered out some of my data. And I'm just going to sort these from smallest to largest. Now, it's very important that when you are going through this exercise yourself, that you not only sort your data, but you sort it both directions. Because here, this information, and to make what we're doing just a little easier to see, I'm going to hide some of these fields. Oops. Let's undo that and hide. So I can see that the new calculator is 2.74 hours lower than the old one on this one. And so I might think, oh, that's great. I only have, one issue and it's on Kim Sloan with 2.74 hours because everything else looks pretty minimal. But you need to remember to sort it both ways because that's just your negative difference. If I do sort largest to smallest, I see that here I have on the new calculator, they get 13 more hours than the old one. So make sure that when you're going through this exercise that you are sorting both directions. And then you'll do the same thing with year-end balance. And what this is doing at this stage is identifying what are the records that we need to look at. So let's go back to our presentation really quickly. So now we have done the analysis steps and created a differences column. Now we actually have to do something with that information.